Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here enjoying the colloquium this afternoon on Saudi Arabia. I think that I'd like to give a kind of general overview to begin with. And the arguments I would make is that the Middle East or the MENA region is really at a crisis point at the moment. I think that we can start, first of all, with Saudi Arabia itself. I think that Mohammed bin Salman is not a particularly effective ruler. I think he's deviated from much of the consensus that's affected Saudi-US relations and Saudi Gulf state relations. And he is trying to create a new vision for Saudi Arabia, which will be one in which oil or petroleum wealth, hydrocarbon exports will not be as important as they were in the past. And certainly he's tried to achieve legitimacy among the younger generation, the up and coming generation, which I think he sees being part of that himself as the future of the country. And of course, we know that allowing men and women to have greater opportunity to go to restaurants and sporting events and other types of activities has earned him a lot of support. At the same time, we still have the legacy of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. We have extensive human rights violations. And I think that's very disturbing because on the one hand, we know that many countries, including the West, are very dependent on Saudi oil. But at the same time, the international community cannot stand by, especially in the current climate where we see someone like Vladimir Putin consistently engaging in war crimes, torturing Ukrainians in a war of choice. There was no legitimacy for him to invade Ukraine. And also now using Iranian Shahed 136 rockets to destroy civilian infrastructure, which is, again, a war crime, according to the UN Charter. So in a world that we've seen a lot of democratic backsliding, we've seen a lot of authoritarian rulers feel that they have no constraints on their behavior. One thing that needs to be done is to create an international consensus that is going to say that Saudi Arabia obviously is an important member of the international community, but one individual, Mohammed bin Salman, cannot be in a position where he is able to treat the country as his playground, as his sandbox, and engage in activities which go against the norms, values, and even the laws of the international community. At the same time, we can see that this is highly problematic because the United States is dependent on support from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in its struggle with Iran, and that's conversely the case. The fact that the United States has supplied Saudi Arabia with extensive weaponry, as well as the Gulf states as bases in the region, and constantly lets the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia know that the United States will protect it from Iranian aggression. And we've seen such aggression, for example, the use of drones used by the Houthis in Yemen to attack Saudi oil facilities and airports. That we need also a strong alliance and consensus against the rogue activities of the Iranian regime. I myself do not see there being any imminent return to the JCPOA, in other words, the nuclear agreement that former President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from. And I think that the brutality that the Iranian regime is showing towards peaceful demonstrators who are part of a younger generation, 80% of which is under the age of 40, makes Iran especially a rogue state. And adding to that problem, of course, is the training and the drones that Iran has sent to Crimea, which are now being used to attack indiscriminately Ukrainian cities with significant infrastructure destruction. 30% of the country's electric grid has been destroyed or damaged, and killing a lot of innocent civilians, including children in playgrounds, in the process. So this presents us with a very difficult situation. I think we're seeing other problems elsewhere, which I won't go into in great detail since we're focusing on Saudi Arabia. We also see Russia withdrawing some of its prime troops from Syria. So we could see in Syria more Iranian involvement, and that crisis take a more ominous direction, also drawing Israel in more closely. We see Lebanon really as a failed state, and Hezbollah being the most powerful force in the state with its close ties to Iran. On the other hand, Hezbollah really doesn't seem to have any kind of program for dealing with the crisis that Lebanon is facing. So on the one hand, we have a Saudi leader who is really not following the norms of the international community. It's true that before he took the rule in the country, there were significant human rights abuses. For example, Raif Badawi, who was flogged and put in jail simply for having published a blog. And now we see Salim al-Mahdi, who is a Saudi American who's 72, has been sentenced to 16 years for tweets that he published over the last 5 or 6 years, and then an additional 15 years not being able to travel, which means that he would be 104 before he could leave Saudi Arabia and come back to the United States. The United States then, from my perspective, and I think this is the important issue, has to adopt a new bipartisan foreign policy. And that foreign policy has to be made explicit to the American people. Why is it important that there be a bipartisan policy? It also means that we need to move much more quickly to renewable energies, so we're not as dependent on countries like Saudi Arabia, who provide us with hydrocarbon wealth. But clearly, the days of the United States running solo, as it were, are over. There has to be a consensus in which the United States, the European Union, Australia, Canada, the NATO powers, the ASEAN powers have to be brought into a situation where we can make sure that on the one hand, our material needs are met, and that in this case, that's oil, but at the same time, actions that contravene human rights, as in Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states also, unfortunately, and Iran, to make sure that Iran continues to be sanctioned in a way that will not allow it to develop more weaponry, which it can use. Now we see being used outside the Middle East, but also potentially against Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and to prop up regimes in Syria and help strengthen the Hezbollah in Lebanon. The other factor that has to be brought into the mix is that one of the reactions of MBS to American criticisms of his policies has been developing a new policy which brings Saudi Arabia closer to China. This is also quite disturbing. China is not the economic power that it was before the beginning of COVID. So its Belt and Road Initiative is not as robust as it once was. But we do see that China has used this Belt and Road Initiative in the many countries to which it has given assistance to manipulate these countries and to put them in a debt position. Obviously, that would not be the case in Saudi Arabia, since Saudi Arabia has a large sovereign wealth fund, as do the Arab Gulf states. But at the same time, if China begins to take the place of the West as a supplier of weaponry and begins to expand its efforts to develop bases, which it tried to do in the UAE and the Gulf, and at the same time is giving greater support to Iran, that only adds to a highly combustible situation. So we need a lot of good minds. We need people who can really think about new strategies, try to work on convincing MBS that he's got to move in a different direction, use the Arab Gulf states to pressure him to do that, along with our other democratic partners in Europe and elsewhere. And unfortunately, much of this cannot just be done behind the scenes. There have to be some public salvos. They don't have to go into a lot of detail, but President Biden does need to come out and talk about those consequences that he threatened when MBS, against the wishes of the West, which is experiencing a high inflation problem, increased the price of oil by reducing Saudi oil production, which of course helps Vladimir Putin, because as oil prices go up, oil is the key mechanism that he uses to fund this highly destructive war. And now let's remember that there's even been talk by the Russian ambassador to the UN of perhaps closing down Ukrainian grain imports, which have already had a very, very damaging effect on Egypt, on Tunisia, and other MENA region states. So this could lead to more internal instability. So Saudi Arabia is really a fulcrum, I would argue, of multiple issues. It has to be looked at from multiple directions. But just to remain silent and allow MBS to continue to function in the way that he has to date, I think will only embolden him to engage in even more problematic initiatives in the future. Thank you.